The night always holds secrets unseen by the eye. Behind the darkness, there are whispers that not everyone can hear, footsteps that shouldn't exist, and shadows that move on their own in the corner of the room. This story isn't just a tale to scare you, it's something that may have happened, or could be happening right now, closer than you think. Listen carefully, and make sure you're not alone while hearing it. Ethan Carter stared at his laptop screen, eyebrows slightly furrowed. He was seated at his small desk in his London apartment, surrounded by scattered books and investigative notes. As a freelance journalist working for a paranormal magazine called The Unseen Files, he was used to receiving emails from readers claiming to have experienced supernatural events. Most were exaggerated or easily explained, but some were truly disturbing. The email he received this morning came from a man named Michael Langley, a 47-year-old resident of Texas. The message was short but sent a chill down Ethan's spine. They came last night. 2 children, a boy and a girl. Their clothes were tattered, their skin pale. They knocked on my door for almost 5 minutes. I nearly let them in, until I saw their eyes. Completely black. No whites, no pupils. Like endless voids. I have never felt fear like that before. Please, I need to know, what did I see? Ethan reread the email multiple times, sensing that something about it was different. Stories about the black-eyed children weren't new to him. He had come across similar reports, mostly from the US and the UK. But what caught his attention was the tone of this message. There was no exaggeration, no attempt to dramatize, just a simple, terrified plea for answers. He decided to reply. Thank you for reaching out, Michael. Can you provide more details? Where exactly did this happen? What did they say? Did you manage to take any photos or recordings? Less than 10 minutes later, Michael responded. I live on the outskirts of El Paso, Texas. It was 2 a.m. when they knocked. At first, I only heard the knocking, then I approached the door and looked through the peephole. They were just standing there, motionless. They asked to come inside. They said, we need to use your phone. Please let us in. Their voices were flat, emotionless, not like normal children. I didn't take any pictures. I was too scared. I know this sounds crazy, but I felt like if I opened that door, I would never be able to close it again. A strange sensation crawled up Ethan's spine. Michael was not the first person to report this. Ethan wasn't the kind of journalist who immediately believed in ghost stories. Over the years, he had debunked countless urban legends and supernatural claims. But there was one thing he had learned to look for: patterns. He opened a new tab on his browser and began searching for reports on black-eyed children. Within seconds, dozens of articles and forum discussions flooded his screen. Most came from amateur blogs and paranormal websites, but a few were from more credible sources, including first-hand witness accounts dating back more than 2 decades. One of the earliest documented cases he found was from 1996, written by a man named Brian Bethel, a journalist in Texas. In his report, Brian described encountering 2 mysterious children in a movie theater parking lot. They asked for a ride home, claiming they had left their money inside. But something about them felt off. Their voices were unnerving, and their eyes completely black left him paralyzed with fear. This wasn't the only case. Over the years, similar stories had surfaced from different parts of the world, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom. Ethan began to realize there was a thread connecting them all. Whatever Michael had experienced, he was not alone. After gathering enough data, Ethan decided to reach out to someone who had spent years investigating this phenomenon, Dr. Marcus Ellison, an independent researcher and author of several books on paranormal entities. Ethan had interviewed Marcus a few years back for a separate investigation into poltergeist activity. He wasn't the kind of person who blindly believed in every conspiracy theory, but he also never dismissed things outright. That evening, Ethan called Marcus. Ethan, it's been a while, Marcus' deep voice came through the phone. Marcus, I need information on the black-eyed children. Ethan went straight to the point. A long pause followed. Why are you interested in them? I received a new report from a man in Texas. The details match previous cases, but there's something about this one that feels different. I want to know, do you think they're real? Marcus let out a slow breath. They're real. I don't know exactly what they are, spirits, interdimensional beings, or something worse. But one thing is certain, they are not children. And if you ever see them, do not open the door. Ethan smirked slightly. Why? What happens if someone lets them in? Marcus' tone grew heavier. There are reports of people who claim to have let them inside. None of them can recall exactly what happened after. They only remember feeling overwhelmingly weak, as if their life force was being drained. Some lost days or weeks of memory. Others became deeply depressed, and some just disappeared altogether. And you believe all of this? Marcus chuckled dryly. Believe it or not, Ethan, I've seen enough evidence to never take the risk. And I strongly suggest you do the same. Despite his skepticism, Ethan decided to follow his journalistic instincts. A few days later, he booked a flight to Texas. His goal was simple, to find out the truth behind the legend. But what he didn't realize was that, from the moment he stepped foot in Texas, something had already taken notice of him. And on his first night there, the knocking would begin. The Texas sun was unforgiving as Ethan drove through the quiet suburban streets on the outskirts of El Paso. Michael Langley had agreed to meet him, but he insisted that his mother, Eleanor Langley, speak to Ethan first. Ethan pulled into the driveway of a modest single-story house surrounded by dry, sun-bleached grass. As he stepped out of his rental car, the front door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with sharp blue eyes and a wary expression. "You're the journalist." Her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable tension beneath it. "Ethan Carter. Thank you for agreeing to meet me, Mrs. Langley." She hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." "But we talk quickly. I don't like to speak of them." Inside, the house smelled of old books and lavender, but there was a heavy air of unease. Ethan could see crosses hanging near the doors and windows, along with bowls of salt placed along the floorboards. They sat in the living room. "Michael told me about his encounter, but he didn't mention you saw them too." Eleanor took a shaky breath. "Because he doesn't know. And I don't want him to." Ethan leaned forward. "Tell me what happened." Her fingers tightened around her teacup. "They came a week before Michael saw them. I was alone that night. My husband passed years ago. It was around 2 in the morning when I heard knocking." Her voice dropped to a whisper. 3 slow knocks. And then, a voice. Ethan waited as she gathered herself. "Ma'am, please. We're lost. Let us in. We need to call our parents." She shuddered. "I almost did. But then I looked through the peephole and saw their faces. They weren't normal children. They were wrong. And their eyes, those horrible, empty eyes." Eleanor set her cup down with a trembling hand. "It wasn't just their eyes. It was the way they spoke. The way they stood, completely still, like statues. They didn't fidget, they didn't glance around. It was like they weren't real." Ethan took out his notebook. "And they didn't try to force their way in." She shook her head. "No. They just kept asking. Politely. Almost, rehearsed. Like they were mimicking human behavior but didn't understand it." A deep frown creased her face. "I stepped away from the door, but then the strangest thing happened. The house got quiet. Too quiet. No crickets, no wind, no ticking from the old clock on the wall. It was like the whole world had stopped moving." She glanced at Ethan, her expression filled with something he rarely saw in people, pure fear. "I knew then, if I opened that door, I would never be the same again." As Eleanor spoke, Ethan discreetly reached for his digital recorder and pressed record. But almost immediately, something strange happened. The screen of the recorder flickered. The audio waveform, which should have been steady, spiked erratically, as if something was distorting the sound. He checked his phone. It was on airplane mode, so no interference should be happening. Trying to ignore it, he continued. Mrs. Langley, after you refused to open the door, what happened? She exhaled slowly. They knocked one last time. Harder. And then, they just left. I waited for hours, too afraid to move. But when the sun finally rose, I opened the door. There were no footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. Ethan frowned. Did you tell anyone? Who would believe me, she said bitterly. People would call me crazy. But I know what I saw. And I know they'll come again. Ethan glanced at his recorder. It was still glitching. He'd never seen anything like it before. Something was interfering with his equipment. Something unnatural. Just as Ethan was about to ask another question, the front door opened. Michael Langley stepped in tall, mid-40s, with a tired look in his eyes. He seemed surprised to see Ethan, but nodded in greeting. I take it my mom told you her story? Ethan stood and extended a hand. Michael, thanks for reaching out to me. Your email was disturbing, to say the least. Michael let out a dry chuckle. Try living through it? He sat down heavily on the couch. Ever since that night, I've been having nightmares. Ethan leaned forward. Nightmares? About what? Michael's hands clenched into fists. I dream that they're inside my house. That I let them in. A deep breath. In the dream, they stand over my bed, staring down at me with those hollow eyes. And I can't move. I can't scream. I can't wake up. But the worst part. He swallowed hard. Every time I wake up, I feel like I'm missing something. Like a piece of myself is gone. Ethan felt an unexpected chill. There was something deeply wrong with this case. Ethan decided to book a room at a nearby motel rather than drive back so late. He needed to review his notes, listen to the recordings, and start drafting his article. The motel was small and cheap, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and a vending machine that barely worked. But it was quiet, which was exactly what he needed. After locking the door and setting up his laptop, Ethan placed his recorder on the nightstand and sat on the bed, listening to the interview he had just recorded. And that's when he noticed it. A low whispering sound beneath Eleanor's voice. At first, he thought it was just static, but as he turned up the volume, his stomach twisted. There were words. Soft, barely audible, but definitely there. Let us in. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He replayed the section over and over, but the whisper never changed. He reached for his phone to take a note when suddenly. 3 slow knocks. His entire body froze. The knocking was coming from his motel room door. Ethan's breath hitched. His hands clenched into fists. He forced himself to stand up, step by step, until he reached the door. He looked through the peephole. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, 2 small, pale faces emerged from the shadows. Black eyes staring directly at him. And then, please, let us in. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. His heart pounded so hard he swore they could hear it. The black-eyed children stood outside his motel door, unmoving. Their pale faces were sickly under the dim hallway light, their hollow, pitch-black eyes reflecting nothing. Please, we're lost. Let us in. The voices were calm, polite too polite. Like actors reading from a script. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. Mrs. Langley's warning echoed in his mind. If you open that door, you will never be the same again. He clenched his fists and forced himself to stay silent. The children knocked again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Then, silence. Minutes passed. Ethan stood frozen, refusing to move. His body trembled, his skin clammy with sweat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he forced himself to peek through the peephole again. They were gone. The hallway outside was empty. But the air still felt wrong. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The first thing Ethan did the next morning was go straight to the motel office. "Hey, you got security cameras here?" he asked the sleepy-looking clerk at the front desk. The clerk, a man in his late 50s with a name tag that read Jim, rubbed his face and yawned. "Yeah, but they don't work half the time." "What's the issue?" "I had someone knocking on my door at 2 a.m. I just want to see who it was." Jim gave him a skeptical look but shrugged. "All right, let's check." He led Ethan into a small back room with an old monitor displaying black and white security footage. Jim scrolled back to 2 a.m. The screen showed the motel hallway outside Ethan's room. At 1:59 a.m., the hallway was empty. At 2 a.m., the footage glitched. The screen went completely black for 5 full seconds. When the footage returned at 2:05 a.m., everything was normal again. No sign of anyone. No sign of the children. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. Jim gave him a sideways glance. "Weird. Power surge, maybe." Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at the screen. He knew what he had seen. And now, he knew something else. The cameras never caught them. Ethan rushed back to his motel room, threw his things into his bag, and headed straight to his rental car. He needed to get out of this town. He slid into the driver's seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and turned it. Click. 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 The engine refused to start. Ethan groaned and tried again. Click. 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 The dashboard lights flickered strangely, and then all the electronics shut off at once. Ethan's blood turned cold. He pulled out his phone, but the screen was black. Completely dead. A feeling of unease crept over him, like unseen eyes were watching. Slowly, he turned his head and glanced at the motel entrance. Standing there, just beyond the parking lot, were 2 small figures. Still. Unmoving. Watching. The black-eyed children. Ethan's breathing hitched. He locked the car doors, though he knew it wouldn't matter. They weren't normal. And they weren't going to let him leave. A sudden vibration startled Ethan. His phone, which had been dead just moments ago, was now ringing. A call from an unknown number. Heart pounding, he hesitated before answering. "Hello." A frantic voice came through the speaker. "Ethan? It's Michael. Listen to me, whatever you do, don't let them in." Ethan gripped the phone tightly. "Michael, how did you get this number?" "My phone was dead." Michael's voice was rushed, panicked. "They're following you, aren't they? I saw them again last night. I think they know we're talking about them." Ethan swallowed hard. "They came to my motel door. And now, my car won't start." Michael cursed under his breath. "That's how it starts. They isolate you. The more attention you give them, the more power they have over you." Ethan glanced toward the motel entrance. The children were gone. But somehow, that was worse. Michael's voice dropped. "Ethan, listen carefully. There's a reason they need you to invite them in. They can't take you unless you let them." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "And if I do?" A beat of silence. Then Michael whispered. "You'll never be seen again." Ethan stumbled out of his car, his mind racing. He needed to get help. He rushed back inside the motel, heading straight for the front desk. "Jim. My car won't start, my phone died, and..." Jim looked up lazily, chewing on a toothpick. "Relax, buddy. You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan caught his breath and ran a hand through his hair. "You have no idea." He turned toward the glass window behind the desk, intending to check if the children were still outside. But when he looked at his reflection, his own eyes were black. Completely, terrifyingly black. Ethan staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head, but when he looked again his eyes were normal. Sweat dripped down his temple. Was he hallucinating? Losing his mind? Or had something already started changing inside him? He didn't have time to think. Because at that moment, the knocking started again. The sound was slow at first. Knock. 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 Then, it grew louder. More urgent. Bang. 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 The walls shook. The motel door rattled in its frame. Ethan pressed his back against the opposite wall, his chest rising and falling in rapid gasps. Go away, he shouted, his voice cracking. Silence. Then. Please, we're cold. Let us in. The voices were soft. Almost pleading. But Ethan knew better. He wasn't going to let them in. He turned toward Jim at the front desk. You hear that, right? Tell me you hear that. Jim frowned, chewing on his toothpick. Hear what? Ethan's stomach dropped. No. No, no, no. He turned back to the door. The knocking continued, shaking the walls. But Jim just stared at him blankly. Kid, maybe you need some sleep. Ethan's hands trembled. He wasn't crazy. He knew what he was hearing. But why couldn't Jim hear it? Desperate to prove he wasn't losing his mind, Ethan pulled out his phone and opened the voice recorder. The knocking hadn't stopped. Bang. 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 He hit record. You hear that? He whispered into the mic. I'm not making this up. Someone is outside my door. After a few seconds, he played the audio back. Static. That's all it was. A deep, distorted static, like an old radio struggling to find a signal. No knocking. No voices. Just static. Then. A whisper, buried beneath the noise. You already let us in. Ethan's entire body went cold. No. That's not possible. His thumb hovered over the delete button. But before he could press it, his phone shut off again. He nearly threw it across the room. Nothing made sense anymore. His instincts screamed at him to run. Ethan sprinted back to his room, shoving his clothes into his backpack with shaking hands. He had to get out of here. He zipped up his bag and turned toward the mirror. And froze. His reflection wasn't moving. Ethan blinked. His reflection stared back, eyes dark and lifeless. Then, slowly, too slowly, it tilted its head. A twisted smile curled across its lips. Ethan stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. That wasn't him. His reflection took a step forward. But Ethan hadn't moved. His mind screamed at him to look away, but he couldn't. Then the lights flickered. For a split second, the reflection wasn't him at all. It was one of them. A black-eyed child, grinning from ear to ear. The lights blinked again, and his normal reflection returned. Ethan gasped for air, gripping the edge of the dresser to steady himself. They were already inside. Ethan's phone buzzed unexpectedly. He didn't want to answer it. But something told him he had to. The screen lit up with a text from Michael. Get out. Now. It's already too late. Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I'm trying. But they. Before he could finish typing, another message popped up. Don't look at them. Don't listen. Whatever happens next, don't answer the door. Ethan's heart pounded. Then, another message. If you see them in a mirror, it means they're inside you. Ethan's breath hitched. His trembling hand slowly lowered the phone. He turned toward the mirror again, terrified of what he might see. But this time, his reflection was gone. The mirror was empty. The light bulbs burst. Shattered glass rained onto the floor. Ethan spun around, but the room was pitch black. A thick, unnatural darkness swallowed everything. A cold breath whispered against his ear. You let us in. Ethan lunged for the door, yanking it open. And froze. The motel hallway was gone. Instead, he stood in a vast, endless black void. A soft giggle echoed behind him. He turned slowly, his body trembling just in time to see them. The black-eyed children stood in the darkness, their empty, soulless eyes locked onto him. One of them smiled. And Ethan finally understood. He was never leaving this place. Ethan gasped as his eyes flew open. Darkness. Not the motel room. Not the hallway. Just emptiness. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. His body felt weightless, like he was floating in an abyss. Then, out of nowhere a light. A flickering, dim glow, like an old street lamp struggling to stay on. Ethan forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady. He wasn't in the motel anymore. He was, somewhere else. A vast, endless road stretched before him, lined with old houses that seemed frozen in time. No sound. No wind. Just an eerie stillness. And then, a knock. Not behind him. Not in front of him. It came from inside his own head. Knock. 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 His stomach twisted. He wasn't alone. And whatever was with him, was already inside. Ethan forced himself forward. His footsteps echoed strangely, like he was walking through a hollow space. The houses around him were identical, same broken windows, same peeling paint, same empty doorways leading into nothingness. He passed a street sign. Welcome to Black Hollow. He had never heard of this town before. Had it even existed before tonight? A cold chill ran down his spine as he kept walking. The air was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on him. Then, he noticed something strange. No matter how far he walked, the houses on either side never changed. It was like he was walking in circles. Like he was stuck. Ethan turned around, intending to go back, but the road behind him was gone. In its place stood a long, dark alleyway that hadn't been there before. And at the end of it 2 small figures stood perfectly still. Black-eyed children. Waiting. Watching. Ethan took a shaky step back. Then, in perfect unison, the children tilted their heads. A slow, unnatural motion, like dolls being wound too tight. And then they started walking toward him. Panic surged through Ethan as he turned and ran. His breath hitched, his legs burned, but he didn't stop. The children's footsteps were eerily silent behind him. Then, bam! He slammed into something solid. A door. His motel door. Ethan spun around, his chest heaving, but the alleyway, the children, the endless road, were gone. He was back in his motel room. The air was thick with an unnatural silence. He could still feel the cold from that strange town clinging to his skin. But he wasn't safe. Not yet. He turned toward the mirror and his stomach dropped. His reflection was there this time. But it wasn't him. His reflection smirked. You let us in. The light bulb overhead flickered. And Ethan finally realized the truth. He hadn't escaped. He had only gone deeper. Ethan's phone buzzed. He hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him not to answer. But he needed answers. He picked up. Michael? I don't know where I am. Something is wrong with this place. At first, silence. Then, breathing. Slow, raspy, inhuman. Ethan. The voice was distorted. A mixture of static and something ancient whispering beneath the surface. We see you. Ethan's grip tightened. Where am I? What do you want? A sickening chuckle crackled through the speaker. Then a whisper, so close it felt like something was right behind him. Look behind you. Ethan's blood ran ice cold. He turned slowly. And the lights went out. The darkness was suffocating. Ethan fumbled for his phone's flashlight, his hands trembling. But before he could turn it on, a breath. Right against his ear. Then, a voice. Soft. Innocent. Please, let us in. Ethan shot forward, blindly feeling for the door handle. But the room had changed. The walls stretched endlessly into the void. The air was thick with an unnatural hum, like 1,000 voices whispering at once. Then a hand touched his shoulder. Ethan spun around, his flashlight finally flicking on. And he screamed. Because standing inches away from him was a child. A boy. No more than 10 years old. With eyes as black as the void. A smile stretched across the boy's face. Too wide. Too unnatural. You already let us in. Ethan stumbled back, his breath ragged as more figures appeared. One by one, they stepped out from the shadows. The black-eyed children had finally surrounded him. And this time, there was nowhere left to run. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He had to fight. He grabbed the nearest object, a lamp from the motel nightstand, and swung it. It passed right through the boy. The child didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath ragged. What are they? The children stood still, watching him with those empty, soulless eyes. Then, as one, they took a step forward. Ethan threw the lamp. It crashed against the wall, the sound shattering the eerie silence. Still, the children didn't react. Like they weren't really there. Or worse. Like they were never human to begin with. Ethan's vision blurred. The walls around him warped, stretched. The floor beneath his feet shifted. A deep hum filled the air like static mixed with whispering voices. He blinked, and suddenly he wasn't in the motel anymore. The furniture had vanished. The walls had turned into endless darkness. The floor beneath him felt wrong. Soft, like wet earth. Then, he looked down. And nearly screamed. His feet weren't touching the ground. He was standing on nothing. Floating in an abyss. And the children. They weren't walking. They were hovering. Gliding toward him. Silent. Unstoppable. He was in their world now. And there was no way out. A new sound pierced the darkness. A voice. Soft, gentle. Familiar. Ethan, honey. Are you there? His mother's voice. The air left his lungs. His mind screamed that it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His mother had died 3 years ago. But the voice continued, filled with warmth. It's okay, sweetheart. Just come this way. Let me see you. Ethan turned and saw her. Standing at the edge of the void, bathed in dim, flickering light. Her hair, her smile, everything was exactly as he remembered. A lump formed in his throat. Mom. She stretched out a hand. Come with me, Ethan. It's okay now. His legs wavered. His body ached to run to her. But something wasn't right. Something about her eyes. They weren't hers. They were black. Ethan's stomach churned. He took a slow step back. You're not my mom. The figure's expression didn't change. Of course I am, sweetheart. The voice was still soft. Still loving. But the warmth was fake. Wrong. Ethan clenched his fists. No. You're lying. The moment he said it, her face twisted. The soft expression vanished, replaced by something cold. Empty. And then, the illusion shattered. His mother faded into shadow, replaced by the black-eyed children. And this time they weren't just staring. They were showing him something. A glimpse of something horrible. Visions flooded his mind. Flashes of people, hundreds of them. Their faces twisted in silent terror. Their bodies frozen in place, trapped in an endless darkness. Their eyes, black. Ethan gasped. They weren't just spirits. They were victims. People who had let them in. People who had never escaped. For the first time, the children spoke. Not in whispers. Not in distant echoes. But in a single, unified voice coming from everywhere at once. You are one of us now. Ethan shook his head violently. No, I didn't let you in. A pause. Then a cold giggle. Yes, you did. The memories hit him all at once. The knocking at his motel door. The first time he saw them in the parking lot. The moment he looked into their eyes. The moment he let the fear in. The moment he answered them. His breath came in short gasps. They hadn't needed him to open a door. They only needed him to acknowledge them. And now, they had him. Ethan ran. He didn't know where he was running to, he just knew he had to move. The abyss around him twisted and warped as he sprinted forward. It wasn't real. None of this was real. Or maybe, this was more real than anything else. The black-eyed children's whisper slithered through the air. You cannot leave. You belong to us now. Ethan ignored them, pushing forward. His legs burned. His lungs ached. But then, a door. Standing alone in the middle of the void. A single wooden motel door. His door. His way out. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the handle and yanked. The door swung open. And he fell. Ethan hit the floor hard. For a moment, he lay there, gasping. His body was soaked in cold sweat. His heart pounded like a hammer against his ribs. He was back. The motel room was exactly as he left it. The cheap furniture. The flickering lamp. The peeling wallpaper. Had it all been a dream? He slowly pushed himself up. His hands trembled. He reached for his phone. 3:33 a.m. A sharp knock echoed from the door. Ethan froze. His stomach twisted violently. Let us in. The whisper came from the other side. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. No. He wouldn't acknowledge them. He wouldn't let them in. Silence. Then a soft chuckle. You already did. Ethan's phone screen glitched, the numbers warping. His reflection in the black glass smirked back at him. And whispered, welcome home. No. No, no, no. Ethan bolted for the door. He gripped the handle and twisted. Locked. His breath came in short gasps. He turned back toward the room. And froze. The motel was different now. Stretched. Twisted. The walls pulsed like they were alive, breathing. The furniture rotted before his eyes. He was still inside their world. Still trapped. The black-eyed children stood at the edges of the room, watching. Waiting. A slow, creeping dread settled into Ethan's chest. He wasn't dreaming. He had never left. Ethan's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The mirror. He grabbed the nearest chair and swung it, shattering the glass into 1,000 jagged pieces. But instead of seeing the motel wall behind it, he saw himself. A distorted version of himself. His reflection stood in a dark void, grinning. Its eyes, completely black. You can't run from us, Ethan. Ethan staggered back. The reflection stepped forward. Not inside the mirror. Into the room. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The black-eyed children surrounded him now, their whispers filling the air. It's time. His reflection grinned wider. You were never supposed to leave this place. The walls of the motel room crumbled away, revealing the abyss once more. And in that endless void countless faces stared back at him. Soulless. Empty. Trapped. Just like him. Ethan's screams were swallowed by the darkness. And then, the door to room 103 stood silent once more. Waiting. For the next traveler to knock. The neon sign of the Whispering Pines Motel flickered against the cold night. A young man, Daniel Carter, stepped out of his car, stretching after the long drive. His GPS had rerouted him here after a road closure. The air felt heavy. Too still. But exhaustion drowned out his unease. He just needed a place to sleep. Daniel approached the front desk, where a tired-looking clerk barely glanced up. One night, the clerk muttered. Daniel nodded. Yeah. Whatever room is available. The man slid a rusty key across the counter. Room 103. A strange shiver ran through Daniel's spine. For a split second, He could have sworn he heard whispers. Daniel dropped his duffel bag onto the bed and sighed. The room smelled stale, the air thick with something he couldn't quite place. His eyes scanned the space. Everything seemed normal, at first. Then, he noticed it. On the nightstand sat an old, worn-out phone. Not the motel's. Something older. Daniel frowned, picking it up. It was still warm. Like someone had just been using it. Next to it, a crumpled receipt. The ink had almost faded, but he could still read the name. Ethan Graves. Daniel's pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. And then, a knock at the door. The knock came again. Soft. Rhythmic. Daniel hesitated, then approached the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw two children. Standing completely still. A boy and a girl. They looked pale, sickly. Their clothes were slightly outdated, like they didn't belong to this time. "Mister." The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "We're lost. Can we come in?" Daniel's stomach twisted. Everything inside him screamed not to answer. But something pulled at him. An unnatural pressure. A force pressing against his mind. His fingers trembled over the lock. Then, the girl tilted her face upward. And Daniel saw her eyes. Completely black. Daniel's breath hitched. Instinct took over. He slammed the door shut, locking it. His pulse thundered in his ears. He stumbled back, grabbing his phone, fumbling to dial someone. Anyone. No signal. The room felt colder. A voice whispered behind him. "Why won't you let us in?" Daniel froze. The children were inside. Standing by the bed. Motionless. Silent. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. He had never opened the door. But they were already here. The girl smiled. "You see us now." Daniel staggered back toward the bathroom, gasping for air. "This isn't real. This isn't real." He flicked on the light and faced the mirror. His reflection stared back. Then, it blinked. But he hadn't. Daniel's blood turned to ice. His reflection tilted its head, grinning. And then, in a voice that was his own, but twisted wrong, it whispered. "You already let us in." The lights flickered, then died. And the screams that followed were swallowed by the darkness. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He was lying on the bed in room 103. His breathing was ragged, his body drenched in sweat. The motel's dim yellow light flickered above him. A dream? No, it felt too real. Slowly, Daniel sat up. His gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of the children. Nothing. He exhaled shakily. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe he was just exhausted from the long drive. Then, he noticed something. The bathroom door was open. He was sure he had closed it before going to bed. And inside, a reflection moved. But Daniel wasn't moving. Daniel's breath hitched. His reflection stood still, watching him. Grinning. Slowly, it raised its hand. Daniel didn't move, but in the mirror, his reflection did. His mind screamed, but his body refused to obey. Then, it spoke his own voice, but distorted, hollow. "You're not supposed to be here, Daniel." Daniel's stomach twisted. The lights flickered. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. Then, the reflection's eyes turned black. And it whispered. "But we can fix that." A knock at the door. Daniel couldn't move. He felt trapped inside his own body, watching as his reflection stepped closer. "Let us in." The whisper slithered through the room, echoing in his skull. "We can set you free." Daniel fought against the paralysis. His fingers twitched. His breathing grew shallow. What did they mean? The reflection tilted its head. "This room is not yours to leave. But someone else can take your place." Daniel's heart pounded. They wanted him to bring someone else here. To take his spot. No, Daniel rasped. I'm not doing that. The black-eyed children said nothing. But the motel responded. The walls began to decay, peeling like old flesh. The air filled with the stench of rot. The bed beneath him sank as if it were alive. The door, the only escape, disappeared. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. There had to be a way out. He wouldn't play their game. He wouldn't become like Ethan. Then he heard it. A voice. Daniel. It was his own voice. Whispering from inside the bathroom. Daniel's entire body went cold. The whispers grew louder. He turned toward the bathroom, toward the mirror. And there, stepping out of the reflection, was himself. A perfect copy. Except for the eyes. Pitch black. Empty. Smiling. It stepped closer, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Why fight it? The copy whispered. You were always meant to stay. Daniel took a step back. His own face grinned wider. I'll make this easier. Then. The lights died. And everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but he could feel it. Something was here with him. A voice whispered inches from his ear. You don't belong anymore, Daniel. Then cold fingers wrapped around his throat. Daniel gasped, struggling against the unseen force. The grip tightened. His lungs burned. His hands clawed at empty air. Then light exploded back into the room. Daniel collapsed onto the floor, coughing, gasping for breath. And when he looked up, his doppelganger was standing over him. Smiling. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. I have to get out. He ran toward the door, but the room had changed. The walls had stretched taller, darker. The floor beneath his feet felt wrong, like wet, rotting wood. The motel wasn't just haunted. It was alive. The door loomed at the end of the room, impossibly far away. He sprinted for it, every step making the walls pulse around him. He reached the handle and twisted. But instead of the hallway, he was staring into another room. Another room, 103. And inside, sitting on the bed, was himself. Daniel's stomach twisted. He turned away from the doorway, but the room behind him had changed again. There was no exit. No windows. No escape. Only mirrors. Lining the walls. Each one reflecting a different version of himself. Some were smiling. Some were crying. And some weren't moving at all. Daniel backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then one of the reflections blinked. And whispered. This is your home now. The air shifted. A familiar voice echoed through the mirrors. You can leave, Daniel. The black-eyed children stood in the reflection. Their soulless eyes bore into him. Cold. Empty. Unforgiving. But you have to bring someone else. Daniel's pulse pounded in his skull. They were giving him a choice. Stay trapped forever. Or lure someone else to take his place. The mirrors trembled. His own reflections whispered in unison. What will you choose? Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Every fiber of his being screamed to resist. But could he survive this? His gaze flickered to the door, the way out. If he did what they asked, he could be free. He imagined finding someone. Bringing them here. Watching as they took his place in this nightmare. Could he really do it? The black-eyed children tilted their heads, waiting. Daniel took a shaky breath. And then he made his choice. The lights flickered. The room began to shift. And with one final breath, Daniel whispered. I'll do it. The air in the room shifted. The moment Daniel uttered those 3 words, I'll do it, the whispering stopped. The mirrors went still. The distorted reflections of himself disappeared. Then, the black-eyed children stepped forward. Their soulless black eyes locked onto him. You have until sunrise. The voice wasn't spoken. It was inside his head, crawling through his skull like insects. If you do not return with another, you will remain here forever. Daniel's stomach twisted. Sunrise. That gave him only a few hours. If he failed, if he couldn't find someone else, he would never leave this motel. A sharp gust of wind hit him. Daniel stumbled forward and suddenly, he was outside. The neon sign of the motel buzzed faintly above him. The parking lot was empty. The night air was thick and humid. For a moment, he stood frozen. He was free. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. His hands trembled. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. Who could he bring back? Then, a thought crept in. There was only one person still awake at this hour. The night clerk. Daniel's pulse pounded as he made his way toward the lobby. The night clerk Kevin was sitting behind the counter, lazily scrolling through his phone. He looked up as Daniel entered, his expression bored. Need something? Kevin asked. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't a monster. But if he didn't do this? He took a deep breath. Hey, man. I think there's something weird in my room. Kevin sighed. Weird how? Daniel swallowed hard. You should check it out. Kevin rolled his eyes. Seriously? It's probably just the old pipes. Daniel forced a nervous laugh. Yeah, maybe, but I swear, I saw something in the mirror. Like a shadow. Kevin groaned. Fine. Let's check it out. As Kevin grabbed the master key and stepped out from behind the counter, Daniel's stomach twisted. He was really doing this. Step by step, they walked toward room 103. Every part of Daniel screamed to stop. To turn back. But he couldn't. His freedom was waiting. They reached the door. Daniel stood back, his fists clenched as Kevin slid the key into the lock. The door clicked open. The air inside was freezing. The room was dark. Silent. Kevin sighed. See? Nothing. Then the lights flickered. Kevin froze. And Daniel saw them. The black-eyed children. They stood inside the room, waiting. Kevin's eyes widened. What the? Then, the door slammed shut. Kevin's screams were muffled as the whispers filled the hallway. Daniel took a shaky step back. The air around him shifted. He felt lighter. The motel was letting him go. He had won. Or so he thought. Because as Daniel turned to leave, he heard it. A whisper. Right behind him. See you soon, Daniel. Daniel stumbled out of the motel, his breath shaking. The cool night air hit his face, but it didn't calm him. His heartbeat was still erratic. His hands still trembled. But it was over. He had done it. Kevin was gone. Taken. The black-eyed children had their new victim. And now, Daniel was free. But as he walked to his car, something gnawed at him. The neon motel sign flickered above him. For a brief second, just a flash, the letters changed. Welcome home, Daniel. He blinked. And just like that, it was back to normal. His stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. He shoved the keys into the ignition, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The engine roared to life. The headlights cut through the night. Without hesitation, he sped down the empty highway, leaving the motel behind. Or at least, he thought he did. The road stretched ahead of him, long, dark, never-ending. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The gas gauge barely moved. His hands tightened on the wheel. Then he saw it. A faint glow in the distance. A neon sign. His breath hitched. It couldn't be. But as he got closer, his worst nightmare was confirmed. It was the motel. No matter how far he drove, he was right back where he started. Daniel's pulse pounded in his skull. His hands were ice cold. He slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the pavement. This isn't real. This isn't happening. He turned off the engine. Closed his eyes. Counted to 10. When he opened them, he was still there. The motel was waiting for him. He stepped out of the car, his legs weak. The motel doors swung open by themselves. A gust of cold air rushed out. And then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from inside. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A figure emerged from the shadows. At first, he thought it was Kevin. But then he saw the eyes. Pure black. Hollow. Empty. Kevin was gone. What stood before him now was something else. The figure stopped at the entrance, staring at Daniel. Then it smiled. Daniel stumbled backward, shaking his head. No. No, this isn't real. But the whispers returned. All around him. In his head. Crawling beneath his skin. You never left, Daniel. His breath hitched. You were never free. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. They had tricked him. The deal was a lie. He had never escaped. And now he never would. The black-eyed children reached for him. The whispers grew louder. The world collapsed into darkness. Somewhere, in the dead of night, a neon sign flickered. Vacancy. Inside room 103, a man sat on the edge of the bed. His face was pale. His eyes were distant. He couldn't remember how he got there. He couldn't remember much at all. But as he looked at the mirror, his reflection didn't move. And behind him, two children stood in the shadows. Smiling. Waiting. Thank you for listening to this story. But remember, never assume this is just a story. Who knows, something might be listening along with you right now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. But be careful, maybe after this, something else has subscribed behind you. See you in the next tale, and may your night remain peaceful, if it can.